Phil Hansen is an artist who wanted nothing more than to perfect pointillism. I always want to throw an extra syllable into that word. Pointillism, making all the dots that turn into one big picture. He wanted nothing more than that, and so he practiced day after day after day, making lots of little dots, until in the midst of art school, all of that effort on doing the exact same thing over and over with his hand and wrist caused him to develop nerve damage, and his hand began to shake. And he couldn't draw dots any longer. He went to a neurologist finally, and the neurologist said, yes, this is permanent nerve damage. That tremor is never going away. But said something that really landed for Phil. He described in his TED Talk about a decade ago, he said that the neurologist told him, why don't you try to embrace the shake? And so he did, and he started experimenting with ideas about making art he never had thought of before. He started with larger scales and bigger materials. He went from a very simple approach to wider horizons, painting with his feet, burning a 2D image onto a 3D wood sculpture. As he began to play with more and more possibilities that this new limitation had forced him into, he concluded, yes, as many artists know, embracing a limitation can drive creativity. He started asking himself new limiting questions, not just the shake, but what if I could only create with $1 worth of supplies? Ended up with a magnificent mural across 30, 60 Starbucks cups. What if I could only paint on my chest? Layer after layer of painting that came up. What if I could only paint with karate chops, he asked. He ended up injuring himself yet again. You can tell he's kind of an extreme artist. But this idea that embracing a limitation can drive creativity, I think it's one, whether it's artistic pursuit or any part of our lives, that can open those wider horizons. I have to tell you, my wife Caitlin, at her work at teaching theater at Berkeley High, she's so excited that the theaters are going to be shut down for 2 years. They're going to renovate the theaters at Berkeley High, and she won't be able to use them at all for 2 years. The kids are going to have to perform elsewhere, and this limitation just thrills her. Because they're going to have to get creative. They're going to think in new ways and imagine, what is theater without this normal constraint? The way I remember first thinking about this in my own artistic process was as in movement and dance, that if one is improvising dance, as I did for many years with Interplay, as I've told you about, you can improvise more freely and creatively the more stable and solid your platform is. The more the platform, the shape under you is strange or moving or changeable, the more cautious and less free your movements are. Remember when I would lead those one-hand dances we've done a couple of in the Vespers services here? 10, 12 years ago, there was one woman who would do the most incredible one-hand dances. She was, by far, of anybody in the room, the most invested, the most present to what was going on. And I don't know the details, but it was clear she had some kind of palsy in her hands. And they kept this shape no matter what she did. And yet it was so clear that through her dance, a teaching of Interplay landed home for me, that within any set of limitations, there are still infinite possibilities. Within any set of limitations, there are still infinite possibilities. So I wonder, are there constraints in the givens of your life that you've learned to embrace? Or are there perhaps constraints that you have resisted, maybe still resist? This might seem like an odd example, but the thing that came to my mind I was thinking about in middle school when I was learning about the depths of the ways Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, those are the two we were talking about at the time, had transformed movements and inspired people. And I wanted to be like them more than anything in the world. That was 7th grade, Marcus. That was like, I couldn't imagine something better to do with my life than emulate leaders like that. And then I was really quite sad to take in and realize that because of my social location, which is not a source of a lot of limitations, but because I'm a white man, I would not be leading revolutionary movements from this body. I could maybe do my part to support them, but I wasn't going to be King or Mandela. That was a hard constraint, a hard limitation to take in for 7th grade, Marcus. But this is the truth of all of our lives. We are not self-created, but begotten. I remember, when we first read the Bible cover to cover in high school, I had this great Bible as literature class, and getting through those pages of begats, right? So-and-so begat, so-and-so begat, so-and-so. I mean, just on and on and on with the begat. But that, I think, is the gem there, is we are begotten. Not self-created, but begotten from a lineage that shapes and constrains who we are and what we can become. And so a challenge for us, my freedom-loving Unitarian Universalists. Have you ever heard it said, maybe you even said it yourself, Unitarian Universalism, we can believe whatever we want. This hallmark of our colloquial theology that has led us astray, I think, over and over. That's the idea that liberalism, that liberal religion's about being free from, right? That free from the creeds and dogmas, the rigid ecclesiastical hierarchies, freedom from confining limitation. But I think there's a cost to all that freedom from. And this is what I mean, that when Henry was being born, before he was born, we were working with midwives out in western New York, who mostly worked with people out in the country, worked with Amish. They were really lovely. I'm telling a couple of stories about them that are not so flattering, but I loved them. One of them, she had been a member of a Unitarian church at one point. And then she said, well, we concluded, Unitarians, they won't tell you what to believe, and they won't be there for you when you need them. Yeah. It's not my experience, but I know what she's talking about. Because what is it that holds us together in this tradition so fully embraces this way of being together that makes sure that we are there for each other when we need it? It's not our freedom of belief. We are called by some historians the wing of the Reformation that never stopped reforming. And I think it's a good thing, this embrace of the living tradition, all of the commitment we have to change, but there is a danger in it that we lose track of some primal bonds of connection, some constraints at the core of what it means to be a people. David Brooks was actually writing about that this week in his column, and I have to say, if you had asked me about 15, 20 years ago if I'd be quoting David Brooks from the pulpit, I didn't want anything to do with anything he had to say, but it's been fascinating to watch his faith journey these last several years since Trump was elected. But this week he said, when societies become liberal all the way down, he read a book about liberalism, and he's thinking about himself as a liberal. And he said they neglect a core truth when they become liberal all the way down. For liberal societies to prosper, they need to rest on institutions that precede individual choice. Families, faiths, attachments to a sacred place. People are not formed by institutions to which they are lightly attached. Their souls and personalities are formed within the primal bonds to this specific family, that specific ethnic culture, this piece of land with its long history to my people, to that specific obedience to the God of my ancestors. These life-altering attachments, he said, are not usually individually chosen. They are usually woven from birth into the fabric of people's beings, into their traditions, cultures, and sense of personhood. And so he articulates the way that unmoored liberalism, that liberalism we hear in the sweet but false sentiment given to our children, you can be anything you want to be. That unmoored liberalism has threatened those more primal bonds, and that's what makes an authoritarian reactivity appealing. It says the authoritarians tell their audiences that the liberals want to take all that is solid, from your morality to your gender, and reduce it to the instability of a personal whim. He says that's the line that the authoritarians are giving that is so effective when in a liberal society those more primal bonds feel threatened. But the truth is, and we're just not good at talking about it, but we do have something more primal that we're working at here, a way of understanding the sacred that is not reactionary, doesn't seek to return to an imaginary better time or pretend that our cultural inheritance has not been shaken or fragmented by the dislocating forces of modernity and colonialism, but instead offers a way of making meaning in the face of life's biggest questions that embraces that fragmentation, that embraces pluralism and mixity. But man, I struggle to talk about it in the kind of simple terms that David Brooks is suggesting we need to in order to be able to out-communicate the authoritarians. So getting closer to Henry's birth, another of the midwives is having a conversation with Henry's mom, and she figures out that we're ministers, and so she has to ask more about that, and she wants to know what this Unitarian Universalism thing is. And so Henry's mom, she explains, well, Unitarian, which means I believe in one source, that we're all connected, and then knowing someone she was talking to who used God language, she said, Universalist, which means I believe in a loving God who wouldn't send anyone to hell. And the midwife took a sharp breath in. She said, well, I'm a Christian, which means I believe in a loving God too, but he has standards. Well, as you can imagine, Henry's mom was speechless. And later, after some reflection, we crowdsourced a response. It was one of those moments you just want that right comeback to say, and you don't have anything, so you need to go find it afterward. And so we crowdsourced a response from our Facebook friends, most of whom were UU ministers. And so finally we had the response that hadn't come in the moment, the line you just wish you could go back in time to deliver. Well, she would have said. In our tradition, we have standards for God. We have standards for God or for any ultimate truth. And these standards, these are the boundaries we establish in order to make room for it all. In order to make so much freedom possible, we define a space that excludes some possibilities. They are the constraints that give our freedom its potency. And this is how contemporary theologian Rebecca Parker talks about it. She says there are 4 boundaries, 4 walls we create where UU theology says no in order to allow for a deeper yes. First, she says, you can hold a view that there is no God, or that God exists, or that there are many gods, but you cannot hold the view that God is the all-powerful determiner of everything that happens, such that there is no exercise of human freedom. Unitarian Universalism is clear there is some measure of freedom accessible to every living being given in the nature of things. Second, she says, you can define salvation, healing, and wholeness in many ways, but you cannot hold the view that there will be an ultimate separation of the saved from the damned, by which the good are rewarded with eternal bliss and the damned are punished with eternal suffering. Our tradition is clear: all souls are of worth. Third, she says you can be devoted to a specific religious practice, such as Christian prayer or Buddhist meditation or pagan ritual, but you cannot hold the view that there's one religion that encompasses the exclusive final truth for all times and places, not even Unitarian Universalism. We are confident that revelation is not sealed. And finally, she writes, you can see this world as tragically flawed, wondrously gifted, or both, but you cannot hold the view that salvation is to be found solely beyond this world. In some life after death or a world other than this world, our UU faith is clear that the ultimate is present here and now. Some measure of freedom, salvation, healing, and wholeness that is for everyone. Revelation is not sealed. The ultimate is present here and now. Unitarian Universalism's creativity, freedom, allows for wildly different expressions of this faith. And that's a beautiful thing. But these constraints, these limitations are what give that freedom its potency. We're not a franchise where beauty is found in the alikeness of every model. You don't go to congregation like subway to subway expecting to find exactly the same sandwich being served. We are unique organisms evolving in relationship with one another, creative projects, each congregation dancing on the same firm foundation, using the same constraints. This is the genius of congregationalism, this idea that is fundamental to who we are and that we will exercise in just a little while when we have our congregational meeting. Congregationalism that creates a stable structure with freedom to change and grow. Let us, in our lives together and each our own, be constrained. Not by any particular articulation of belief, but by an understanding of the sacred that makes room for it all. Let our creativity be unfurled by knowing there is a solid, unmoving foundation supporting us, and that through its limits, we can let our religious imagination run wild. May it be so, and amen.